17 Marines trapped in the wadi below. 46 enemy fighters closing from 3 directions. One narrow corridor that might serve as an escape route running straight through a killing field. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Kessler pressed her cheek against the stock of her M40A6 and counted the mathematics of survival. Her spotter, Corporal Dwayne Okonkwo, lay motionless beside her, blood pooling beneath his torso from shrapnel wounds that should have killed him already. The radio on her belt crackled with static, damaged beyond function. And in her magazine, she had exactly 23 rounds remaining to change the outcome of an equation that had no solution. 9 minutes. That was her calculation. 9 minutes before the enemy completed their encirclement and turned that wadi into a mass grave. Before we go any deeper into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed situations where someone tried to warn others about danger that nobody wanted to hear. The enemy fighters moved with the confidence of men who believed the hard work was already finished. They had watched American patrol patterns for months, studied the routes, identified the predictable rhythms of complacency. And 72 hours ago, when intelligence analysts had stamped this mission as low threat with minimal enemy activity, those fighters had smiled and begun their final preparations. But they had made one critical error in their calculations. They had seen the sniper team moving toward the ridge during the initial ambush. They had fired on that position and watched one figure fall. They had assumed both threats were neutralized. They had moved on to the primary slaughter. They assumed wrong. 72 hours earlier, Staff Sergeant Kessler had stood in the briefing tent at Forward Operating Base Rawlinson and felt the familiar weight of dread settle into her stomach. Captain Brent Hollister stood at the front, pointer in hand, gesturing at a map that showed their patrol route winding through a valley the intelligence officers had painted in cool, reassuring blue. Low threat. The words appeared in crisp letters across the terrain, features like a promise. Kessler studied the satellite imagery pinned beside the map. Something about the photographs bothered her in a way she could not articulate. A detail lurking at the edge of recognition that refused to come into focus. She had learned to trust that sensation. It had kept her alive through 3 deployments when others who ignored such whispers had come home in flag-draped cases. "Captain," she said, and every head in the tent turned toward her. "I have concerns about this route." Hollister's expression flickered with something between annoyance and condescension. He was 34 years old, son of a family friend to a 2-star general, and counting the days until his promotion board. He needed clean missions for his record. Simple patrols that checked boxes without complications. "Go ahead, Staff Sergeant," he said in a tone that suggested her concerns had already been dismissed. "The pattern analysis on enemy movement shows unusual clustering in the ridgelines east of our route over the past 2 weeks," Kessler said. "Combined with the decrease in visible activity in the valley itself, it suggests possible preparation for coordinated action." Hollister smiled the patient smile of a man explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "Staff Sergeant Kessler," he said, "the intelligence professionals who analyze these patterns have marked this sector as low threat. Are you suggesting you know more than they do?" "I am suggesting that patterns sometimes indicate what is coming rather than what has been," she replied. Several Marines in the tent exchanged glances. Corporal Okonkwo caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod of support. Lance Corporal Tomas Fuentes, barely 20 years old and on his first deployment, watched the exchange with the wide eyes of someone learning that officers did not always welcome input from experienced NCOs. "Your concerns are noted," Hollister said in a voice that made clear they were not noted at all. "But we execute the mission as briefed, unless you have lost confidence in your ability to perform your duties." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the tent, Marines carefully studied their boots or the ceiling or anything that allowed them to avoid witnessing their staff sergeant's public humiliation. "No, sir," Kessler said. "I will perform my duties." "Outstanding." Hollister turned back to his map with the satisfied air of a man who had resolved a minor inconvenience. "We step off at 0530. Get some rest." That night, Kessler sat outside her quarters cleaning her rifle by the light of a headlamp. The familiar ritual of disassembly and reassembly usually calmed her mind, but tonight her thoughts kept returning to those satellite photographs. The absence that felt like presence. The quiet that screamed, "You know he is not going to listen." She looked up to find Okonkwo settling onto the crate beside her. His broad face carried the easy warmth that made him one of the most liked Marines in the platoon and the steadiest spotter she had ever worked with. "I know," she said. "So why say anything?" Kessler's hands continued their work on the rifle, muscle memory performing the motions while her mind wandered elsewhere. "My father was a Marine," she said. "Died in a training accident when I was 16. His unit commander had cut corners on safety protocols to meet a timeline. Everyone knew it was dangerous. Nobody said anything. Okonkwo was quiet for a moment. "And you decided you would always be the one who says something." "Something like that." He nodded slowly. "My daughter took her first steps last week. My wife sent video. I watched it 11 times before I could put my phone down." Kessler looked at him. "You will see plenty of steps when we get home." "That is the plan." He stood and stretched. "Get some sleep, Yolanda. Whatever happens tomorrow, you will need to be sharp." She watched him walk away into the darkness, then returned her attention to her rifle. In her pocket, her father's compass pressed against her thigh, a reminder of promises made to the dead. At 05:30 the next morning, the platoon stepped off into a valley painted in shades of brown and gold by the rising sun. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant vegetation. It was beautiful country, peaceful country, the kind of landscape that made you forget men had been killing each other in these mountains for thousands of years. Kessler took her position near the rear of the formation, Okonkwo beside her, both of them scanning the ridge lines with the automatic vigilance that came from years of training. The patrol moved in good order, spacing proper, noise discipline maintained. A textbook operation in textbook terrain. Hollister walked near the front, his bearing relaxed, occasionally making small talk with his radio operator. A commander at ease with his low-threat mission. And on the ridge lines above, hidden in positions that had been visible in those satellite photographs, if anyone had looked closely enough, 46 fighters watched the Americans walk into their trap. Kessler felt it before she saw it. That prickle along the spine that preceded violence. She opened her mouth to key her radio. The first RPG streaked down from the eastern ridge, and the world exploded into chaos. The explosion threw 3 Marines off their feet before anyone could process what was happening. Dust and smoke erupted from the valley floor as the RPG round detonated against a rock formation that had provided the illusion of cover. Then the machine guns opened up from the western ridge, and the screaming began. Kessler was already moving before conscious thought engaged. She grabbed Okonkwo by his tactical vest and hauled him toward a shallow depression in the terrain as rounds cracked through the air where they had been standing. All around them, the platoon scattered like insects under a sudden light, Marines diving for whatever cover the valley offered while fire poured down from multiple elevated positions. "Contact east and west," Okonkwo shouted over the din. At least 3 positions each side. Kessler's mind processed the tactical geometry with cold precision, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Elevated positions on both ridgelines meant the enemy had planned this ambush for maximum lethality. The valley floor offered almost no defensible terrain, and the volume of fire suggested this was not a harassment action or a probe. This was an annihilation operation. "We need high ground," she said. "Now." Captain Hollister's voice cut through the chaos on the radio net, broken and high with panic. "All units fall back to the wadi. Repeat, fall back to the wadi for defensive positions." It was a wrong call. Kessler knew it instantly. The wadi offered concealment, but no escape route. Consolidating there would make the platoon easier to encircle and destroy. But Hollister was the commanding officer, and Marines followed orders even when those orders were given by men who had never truly understood war. "Yolanda." Okonkwo's voice pulled her attention. "High ground." "You said high ground." She looked at the northern ridge. Unlike the east and west positions that were crawling with enemy fighters, the northern slope appeared unoccupied, a deliberate gap in the ambush formation. The enemy wanted the Americans to flee north into what they assumed was safety, where a blocking force would be waiting to complete the slaughter. But the ridge itself was different. If she could reach an elevated position before that blocking force moved into place, she could see the entire battlefield. She could identify the escape routes that existed and the ones that were traps. She could provide the kind of overwatch that might give 17 Marines a chance to survive. "Stay with the platoon," she told Okonkwo. "Get to the wadi." Not a chance. He checked his rifle and met her eyes with the steady resolve she had come to depend on over 2 deployments together. "You need a spotter. I am your spotter. We go together or not at all." There was no time to argue. Kessler nodded once, and they began their movement toward the northern slope, using the chaos of the ambush as cover. Around the Marines were returning fire at the ridgelines, disciplined bursts that spoke to their training even as the situation deteriorated. She saw Lance Corporal Fuentes dragging a wounded Marine toward the wadi, the young man's face set with determination that belied his inexperience. They reached the base of the northern slope as a second wave of RPGs arced down into the valley. The explosions walked across the terrain like the footsteps of an angry giant, throwing debris and bodies in equal measure. Kessler forced herself not to look back. She could not help anyone from down here. The only way to save them was up. The climb was brutal. Loose scree shifted beneath their boots, and the weight of their equipment dragged at muscles already burning with adrenaline and exertion. Halfway up, round began impacting around them as enemy fighters on the eastern ridge spotted their movement. Okonkwo grunted as a fragment caught his left arm, but he kept climbing, blood streaming down to his wrist and dripping onto the rocks. "Almost there," Kessler said. 30 more meters. They covered those 30 meters in a desperate scramble that felt like 30 miles. When they finally crested the ridge and threw themselves into a natural depression between 2 boulders, Kessler immediately brought her rifle up and began scanning the battlefield below. What she saw turned her blood to ice. The enemy was not just attacking. They were executing a textbook encirclement. Fighters were moving along both ridge lines toward the southern end of the valley, cutting off any retreat. More fighters were advancing from the north, the blocking force she had anticipated preparing to seal the trap from that direction. And in the wadi where Hollister had ordered the platoon to consolidate, 17 Marines huddled in a depression that was about to become their grave. "Dwayne," she said quietly, "get on the scope. I need numbers." Okonkwo pulled himself into position beside her, ignoring the blood still flowing from his arm. He pressed his eye to the spotting scope and began counting. "East Ridge, I have 20 plus. West Ridge, another 15 to 20. Northern blocking force moving into position, maybe 10 to 15 more. 46 fighters minimum against 17 Marines in an indefensible position with no air support and no quick reaction force close enough to matter." Kessler studied the terrain with desperate intensity, searching for something that might offer hope. The wadi ran roughly north to south through the valley floor. The enemy controlled the high ground on 3 sides. But there to the southwest, she spotted a narrow drainage channel that cut through a gap in the western ridge. It was exposed, covered by at least 3 machine gun positions, but it was the only terrain feature that offered any possibility of escape. "I see a route," she said. "Southwest. That drainage channel." Okonkwo shifted his scope. "I see it. Also see 3 guns covering it. Anyone who tries to run that gauntlet gets cut to pieces. I need to take out those guns." She did the math in her head. 3 machine gun positions. 23 rounds in her magazine. Unknown number of fighters at each position. And somewhere out there, enemy snipers who would be hunting for exactly the kind of threat she represented. "Radio," she said. "I need to tell them the plan." She keyed her handset and heard nothing but static and fragments of broken transmissions. The unit had taken damage during their climb, likely from the same fragment that had wounded Okonkwo. She tried again with the same result. The platoon could not hear her. "Okonkwo," she said, "my radio is down. Can you raise anyone?" He tried his own handset, his face growing grimmer with each attempt. "Negative. I am getting nothing but garbage. 17 Marines, trapped below with no idea that an escape route existed. No way to tell them where to run or when to move. And the encirclement tightening by the minute. Kessler looked at the wadi and saw Lance Corporal Fuentes taking cover behind a rock formation, his young face scanning the ridgelines with a mix of fear and determination. He was positioned at the edge of the platoon's perimeter, almost directly below her position. If she could get his attention, if she could signal the escape route somehow, if he understood and could relay the information to the others. It was a desperate plan built on assumptions and hope, but was the only plan she had. Then Okonkwo made a sound beside her, a wet gasp that she had heard too many times before. She turned to find him slumped against the boulder, fresh blood spreading across his chest from wounds she had not seen him take. His eyes met hers with an apology already forming on his lips. "Took a couple more on the way up," he said. "Did not want to slow us down." His head dropped forward and his body went still. Kessler pressed 2 fingers against Okonkwo's neck and felt the faint flutter of a pulse. Alive. Barely. The chest wounds were bad, but not immediately fatal if she could control the bleeding. She tore open his medical kit and went to work, packing the wounds with gauze and applying pressure with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will. "Stay with me, Dwayne," she said. "Your daughter needs to see you walk through that door." He did not respond. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the rhythm of a body fighting to maintain the basic functions of life. She secured the bandages as best she could and turned her attention back to the battlefield below. There was nothing more she could do for him here. The only way to save Okonkwo was to save the platoon, get them extracted, get him to a surgical team. She checked her rifle and settled into a stable, firing position. The nearest machine gun emplacement sat 600 meters to the southwest, a 2-man team behind a natural rock barrier that gave them excellent coverage of the drainage channel. They were the first lock on the door. She would have to pick them open one at a time. Through her scope, she watched the enemy fighters moving with disciplined coordination. These were not untrained insurgents with aging weapons and more enthusiasm than skill. These men knew exactly what they were doing. They communicated with hand signals, maintained proper spacing, and positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire. Someone had trained them well and planned this ambush with professional precision. The realization made her angrier rather than more afraid. This had been preventable. The signs had been there in those satellite photographs, in the pattern analysis she had presented, in every instinct that had screamed at her to push harder against Hollister's arrogant dismissal. And now Marines were dying in a wadi because a captain needed a clean mission for his promotion board. She pushed the anger down into the cold place where it could fuel her focus rather than cloud her judgment. Emotion was a luxury she could not afford. Mathematics was what mattered now. Distances and wind speed and bullet drop and the narrow margin between a killing shot and a miss that would reveal her position. The first machine gun position. 2 fighters. One on the gun, one feeding ammunition and watching for threats. The gunner was partially exposed, his head and shoulders visible above the rock barrier as he tracked the wadi below. The loader sat lower, only the top of his head occasionally visible when he shifted position. Kessler calculated the shot. 600 meters, minimal wind, slight uphill angle. She adjusted her scope and placed the crosshairs on the gunner's upper chest. A headshot would be cleaner, but the chest offered a larger target, and she could not afford a miss. Not with 23 rounds between her and the impossible task of opening that escape route. She exhaled slowly, felt her heartbeat in the pause between breaths, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and 600 meters away, the gunner jerked backward and collapsed across his weapon. The loader's head came up in confusion, searching for the source of the shot. Kessler worked the bolt and fired again. The second round caught him as he started to rise, spinning him sideways and dropping him beside his partner. 2 rounds expended. 2 enemy down. 21 rounds remaining. For a moment, nothing happened. The other machine gun positions continued their fire on the wadi, unaware that one of their number had just been silenced. Then someone on the eastern ridge spotted the bodies and began shouting. Kessler saw fighters pointing toward her position, saw weapons swinging in her direction. She pressed herself flat against the rock as rounds began impacting around her. Stone chips sprayed across her back and shoulders. The enemy knew where she was now. They would be adjusting, repositioning, sending hunters to deal with the sniper threat before completing their encirclement. She had bought herself minutes at best. Minutes to take out 2 more machine gun positions while being actively hunted by dozens of fighters who now knew exactly where to look. Down in the wadi, the reduction in fire from the first gun position had not gone unnoticed. Kessler risked a glance over her cover and saw Marines shifting, trying to identify what had changed. She saw Fuentes near the edge of the perimeter, his head turning toward the ridge where she lay hidden. "Look at me," she willed him. "See me. Understand what I am trying to tell you." She could not signal him directly. Any movement would draw fire and reveal her exact position to the hunters closing in. But if he was watching, if he could follow her muzzle flash when she took the next shot, maybe he could piece together what she was doing. The second machine gun position sat 800 meters out, further along the western ridge. A harder shot, a longer exposure. She studied the position through her scope and counted 3 fighters this time. The gun itself was a heavier model, the kind that could tear through the wadi's minimal cover and turn Marines into memories. Rounds continued to crack overhead as she calculated the new firing solution. 800 meters. Still minimal wind, but the angle was different, more of a cross-slope shot that would require compensation. She adjusted her scope and waited for a pause in the incoming fire. It came 3 seconds later as the fighters hunting her repositioned for a better angle. Kessler rose just enough to acquire her target and fired. The round took the gunner through the throat, and he slumped forward over his weapon. She worked the bolt and fired again, catching the loader as he lunged for the gun. The third fighter at that position dove for cover before she could acquire him. 2 more down, but the position was not fully neutralized. And now the return fire intensified, rounds chewing into the rocks around her with renewed fury. She felt a sharp burning across her left shoulder and knew, without looking, that a fragment had found flesh. The wound was minor, but the blood would make her grip slippery if she did not address it. She pressed a hand against the wound and scanned for the third fighter at the second position. He was huddled behind cover, unwilling to expose himself to her rifle. Smart, but his fear meant the gun stayed silent, and that was almost as good as a kill. 19 rounds remaining. 1 machine gun position eliminated. 1 suppressed. 1 still fully operational and covering the most critical section of the escape route. And somewhere below, Lance Corporal Fuentes was staring up at the ridge with dawning comprehension in his eyes. He had seen the muzzle flashes. He had watched the machine gun positions go silent. And now his gaze was tracking toward the drainage channel, toward the gap in the enemy's fire that Kessler was trying to create. He understood. She could see it in the way his body shifted, the way he began looking at the other Marines around him. He was going to try to organize them, to prepare them for the run she was making possible. But the encirclement was tightening faster than she had calculated. Fighters from the northern blocking force were already visible on the slopes above the wadi, moving into positions that would seal the trap completely. She had maybe 7 minutes now instead of 9. 7 minutes to neutralize that final gun position, to signal the escape route, to somehow get Okonkwo off this ridge. 7 minutes before 17 Marines and the unconscious man beside her became casualties of a low-threat mission that had never been low threat at all. Kessler checked her rifle, checked her wounds, and prepared for the shot that would determine everything. The third machine gun position was the worst of them all. Kessler studied it through her scope and felt the cold mathematics of the situation pressing against her chest like a physical weight. The position sat at the narrowest point of the drainage channel, perfectly placed to turn that entire corridor into a killing ground. For fighters manned this emplacement, 2 on the gun itself, and 2 providing security with rifles trained on the approaches. They had constructed a proper fighting position with sandbags and overhead cover, the kind of preparation that spoke to weeks of planning rather than hasty improvisation. 1,100 meters, nearly 3/4 of a mile. At that distance, even a slight miscalculation in wind or elevation would send her rounds wide. In the overhead cover meant she would need to wait for the gunner to expose himself, which meant waiting for him to fire, which meant waiting for Marines to die. She could not wait. Behind her, Okonkwo's breathing had grown more labored. The field dressings were holding, but he needed surgery, needed blood, needed things she could not provide on this exposed ridge with hunters closing from every direction. Each minute that passed reduced his chances of survival. Each minute brought the encirclement closer to completion. Down in the wadi, the situation was deteriorating in ways that made her stomach clench. Captain Hollister had positioned himself behind a rock formation near the center of the platoon's perimeter, his radio pressed to his ear as he called desperately for air support that would not arrive in time. His voice carried up the slope in fragments, high and tight, with barely controlled panic. She could hear him demanding extraction helicopters, close air support, anything that would save him from the consequences of his own arrogance. The Marines around him were holding together through training and discipline rather than leadership. Sergeants had taken control of their fire teams, directing suppressive fire at the ridge lines and keeping the platoon from dissolving into chaos. But they were burning through ammunition at an unsustainable rate, and the enemy showed no signs of withdrawing. This was a siege now, a slow strangulation that would end only one way unless something changed. Fuentes had gathered 3 other Marines near the southwestern edge of the perimeter. She watched him pointing toward the drainage channel, watched him gesturing at the silent machine gun positions she had already neutralized. He was explaining the escape route to them, preparing them to move. Smart kid. He had figured out the plan without a single word of communication. But he could not move yet, not with that 3rd gun still active. The moment anyone entered the drainage channel, that position would open up and cut them down before they made it 20 meters. She had to silence it first. She had to find a way. Kessler shifted her position slightly, searching for a better angle on the emplacement. The movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her wounded shoulder, and she bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Blood had soaked through her sleeve and was beginning to drip onto the stock of her rifle. She wiped it away and forced herself to focus. The overhead cover protected the gunner from direct fire, but it also limited his visibility. He could only engage targets in a narrow arc directly in front of his position. If someone approached from an oblique angle, he would have to reposition to engage them. That repositioning would expose him for perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds. One shot. 1,100 meters. It was not a shot she could make reliably. Not wounded, not tired, not with the pressure of 17 lives weighing on every breath. But it was the only shot available. She was calculating angles of approach when movement on the eastern ridge caught her attention. 3 fighters were working their way along the slope toward her position, moving with the careful deliberation of men who knew exactly where their target was hiding. The hunters had found her trail. They would reach effective range within 4 minutes, maybe less. For minutes to take an impossible shot before she had to deal with the men coming to kill her. For minutes before her window closed permanently. Okonkwo stirred beside her, and she nearly jumped at the sound. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with pain, and he tried to speak. The words came out as a wet whisper that she had to lean close to hear. Status, he managed. 2 guns down, she said. 1 to go. Hunters incoming. His hand moved weakly toward his rifle. I can still spot. You can barely breathe. Then let me breathe while being useful. His eyes found hers with a clarity that cut through the pain and the blood loss. You need someone to watch your back while you take that shot. Stop arguing and let me do my job. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to order him to stay still, to conserve his strength, to give his body a chance to stabilize. But he was right. She could not watch the approaching hunters and line up an 1,100-meter shot at the same time. She needed him even if using him might kill him. She helped him shift into a position where he could observe the eastern ridge through his scope. His movements were slow and his breathing caught with each adjustment, but he managed to stabilize himself against the rocks. 3 targets, he said, moving in a tactical column. 250 meters out and closing. Call them, she said. I need 30 seconds of uninterrupted focus. You have got it. Kessler turned her attention back to the third machine gun position. 1,100 meters. For fighters. Overhead cover. An impossible shot that had to become possible because the alternative was unthinkable. She watched the gunner's position through her scope and waited. Down in the channel, she could see movement among the rocks. Fuentes had pushed too far forward, trying to assess the route. He was exposed, visible to the gun position if the gunner happened to look in that direction. Do not see him, she whispered. Keep your eyes on the wadi. But the gunner was already turning, his weapon tracking toward the drainage channel, where Fuentes crouched behind inadequate cover. The young Marine was about to die because he had trusted her to open the door, and she had not done it yet. Kessler stopped thinking. She let her body take over, all the years of training and practice and muscle memory condensing into a single crystalline moment of pure focus. The crosshairs settled on the narrow gap between the overhead cover and the sandbag wall, where the gunner's head would appear when he leaned forward to fire. The gunner leaned forward. She squeezed the trigger. 1,100 meters away, the round found flesh and the gunner dropped. 18 rounds remaining. 3 fighters at that position still alive. And behind her, Okonkwo's voice cut through the ringing in her ears with words that turned her blood cold. Contact 50 meters. They're on us. Kessler rolled onto her back and brought her rifle around just as the first hunter crested the rocks above their position. He was young, maybe 20, with a beard that had not fully grown in and eyes wide with the adrenaline of closing on his prey. He had expected to find a wounded sniper cowering behind cover. He had not expected her to be waiting for him. She fired from a position that would have made her instructors wince. The rifle braced against her hip with no proper sight picture. At 15 meters, it did not matter. The round caught him center mass, and he tumbled backward into the fighter behind him. The collision bought her 2 seconds to adjust her position as Okonkwo opened fire with his sidearm, the sharp crack of the pistol mixing with the deeper boom of her rifle. The third hunter dove behind a boulder and began spraying rounds in their direction. Rock chips exploded around Kessler's head as she pressed herself flat against the ground. Okonkwo had stopped firing. She risked a glance and saw him slumped forward, the pistol fallen from his grip. Whether he had passed out again or been hit, she could not tell. She forced herself to focus on the immediate threat. One fighter behind cover, 15 meters away, with an automatic weapon and the patience to wait her out. If she stayed pinned here, the encirclement would complete below, and everyone would die. If she exposed herself to take the shot, she would probably die. The mathematics of sacrifice. Her life against 17 others. It was not a difficult calculation. She drew a breath and prepared to rise when the fighter made his own decision. He broke from cover in a rush, weapon blazing, trying to close the distance before she could react. It was the wrong choice. Kessler's rifle came up smooth and steady, years of training converting panic into precision, as she put 2 rounds through his chest before he covered half the distance. 16 rounds remaining. She crawled to Okonkwo and found him breathing but unconscious again. A new wound had appeared on his thigh, adding to the blood loss that was slowly killing him. She applied a tourniquet with hands that trembled only slightly and tried not to think about how little time he had left. The drainage channel. She had to get back to the drainage channel. She returned to her scope and found the third gun position in chaos. The remaining 3 fighters were arguing, gesturing toward her ridge, clearly debating whether to abandon their post and deal with the sniper threat. One of them finally took position behind the gun and began firing into the wadi, either to prove the position was still active or because he genuinely believed the Marines were the greater threat. Kessler watched him through her scope and felt the cold settle back into her bones. 1,100 meters. The same impossible distance. But she had made the shot once. She could make it again. The gunner shifted and she fired. The round caught him in the shoulder instead of the chest, spinning him away from the weapon but not killing him. She worked the bolt and fired again as another fighter lunged for the gun. This shot was true, dropping him across his wounded companion. 14 rounds remaining. One fighter left at the position, huddled behind cover and showing no inclination to man the gun. The drainage channel was open. Down in the wadi, Fuentes had seen the gun go silent. She watched him turn to the Marines he had gathered, watched his mouth moving as he explained what they needed to do. 3 of them nodded. A 4th shook his head violently, gesturing toward Hollister as if seeking permission from the captain who had led them into this trap. Hollister was still on his radio, still demanding support that was not coming, still failing to recognize that salvation was sitting right in front of him if he would only look up and see it. Fuentes made a decision. He grabbed the reluctant Marine by his vest and pulled him close, speaking directly into his face with an intensity that carried even at this distance. Whatever he said worked. The Marine nodded, and the group began moving toward the drainage channel. 5 Marines. Only 5 out of 17. The others were still pinned in the wadi, still looking to Hollister for guidance, still waiting for orders that would never come. Kessler scanned the ridgelines and felt her chest tighten. The encirclement was nearly complete. Enemy fighters had reached positions that would allow them to fire directly into the drainage channel within minutes. Fuentes and his group might make it through. The rest would not. She had to buy more time. The fighters on the eastern ridge were the closest threat, a group of 8 working their way along the slope toward positions overlooking the channel. She shifted her aim and began the grim calculus of triage. Which targets would create the most delay when eliminated? Which deaths would cause the most confusion? Which men had to die so that others might live? Her first shot took the lead fighter as he climbed over a rock formation. The man behind him froze, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Her second shot removed his uncertainty permanently. 12 rounds remaining. The group scattered, seeking cover, their advance stalled. She had bought perhaps 2 minutes. 2 minutes for Fuentes to get his people through the channel. 2 minutes that would mean nothing for the 12 Marines still trapped below. Kessler looked at the wadi and saw Hollister finally lower his radio. He was staring at the drainage channel, watching Fuentes and his group disappear into the corridor she had opened. Understanding was dawning on his face, the slow, terrible recognition that his sergeant had seen what he had not. That the soldier he had humiliated in front of the entire platoon was now the only reason any of them might survive. "Move," she whispered. "Get them moving." But Hollister did not move. He stood frozen behind his rock, paralyzed by the gap between the leader he believed himself to be and the leader this moment required. The Marines around him looked to him for orders and received nothing. Seconds ticked away. The encirclement tightened, and 12 men waited to die because the man responsible for their lives could not accept that a staff sergeant had been right all along. Kessler felt something break inside her. Not her focus, not her discipline, but something deeper. Some last fragment of faith in the system she had served for 14 years. She had warned them. She had told them exactly what would happen. And they had laughed at her and called her paranoid and walked 17 Marines into a trap that a cursory review of satellite photographs would have revealed. Her father had died because a commander cut corners. These Marines were dying because a commander could not admit he was wrong. The pattern repeated. The pattern always repeated. And she was so tired of watching good people pay for the failures of those above them. Beside her, Okonkwo stirred. His eyes opened and found hers, and in them she saw the same exhaustion, the same grief, the same stubborn refusal to surrender. "How many left?" he whispered. 12 rounds, she said. 12 Marines still in the wadi, and maybe 4 minutes before it is over. He reached out and touched her arm with fingers that had gone cold. "Then make them count." She turned back to her scope and began searching for targets that would buy the most time. Behind her, the man who should have been dead hours ago pulled himself upright and raised his pistol toward the ridgeline. Together, whatever happened next, they would face it together. The revelation came to her between heartbeats, a flash of clarity that illuminated everything she had sensed but failed to articulate. Kessler was scanning the enemy positions through her scope when her eye caught a familiar rock formation on the western ridge. She had seen that exact formation before, not in person, not from this angle, but in the satellite photographs she had studied before the mission briefing. She remembered the image now with perfect clarity. The cluster of boulders, the shadow patterns that indicated depth and concealment. And they're barely visible in the enhanced resolution, the straight lines that did not belong in nature. Fighting positions, prepared emplacements, evidence of human construction that any trained analyst should have flagged immediately. The intelligence failure had not been incompetence. It had been willful blindness. Someone had looked at those photographs and seen exactly what she had seen. Someone had made the choice to ignore it, to stamp the mission as low threat because acknowledging the danger would have complicated the narrative, would have delayed the patrol, would have required the kind of careful planning that did not fit into Captain Hollister's timeline for career advancement. Her father's face surfaced in her memory. The photograph they had shown her at the memorial, the one where he was smiling in his dress blues with the pride of a man who believed in the institution he served. He had believed right up until the moment that institution killed him through negligence and covered it up through bureaucracy. The pattern repeated. It always repeated. And the only people who paid the price were the ones at the bottom, the ones who followed orders and trusted their leaders and died in places that should never have been dangerous. Rage flooded through her with a heat that threatened to crack her focus. She wanted to scream at the men who had made these decisions, the analysts who had chosen convenience over accuracy, the officers who had prioritized careers over lives. She wanted them to see what their choices had cost. 17 Marines in a wadi. A spotter bleeding out beside her. Good people dying because bad people could not be bothered to look closely at a photograph. But rage was a luxury she could not afford. Not with 12 rounds in 4 minutes and 12 Marines still waiting to die. She channeled the anger into ice and returned to her scope. The eastern ridgeline had reorganized. The fighters she had scattered were moving again, more cautious now, but still advancing. They would reach positions overlooking the drainage channel within 2 minutes. When they did, the escape route would close, and everyone still in the wadi would be trapped. Kessler picked her targets with cold precision. A fighter climbing a boulder. A man directing others with hand signals. Another adjusting a machine gun on a tripod mount she had not previously identified. 3 shots. 3 kills. 9 rounds remaining. The advance stalled again, but she knew it would not last. There were too many of them and too few bullets in her magazine. She was fighting mathematics, and mathematics always won. Down in the wadi, something had finally shifted. Hollister was moving, not with the confidence of command, but with the desperate energy of a man who had realized his survival depended on action. He was grabbing Marines, pushing them toward the drainage channel, shouting orders that probably made no tactical sense, but at least got bodies moving in the right direction. Too little, too late, but better than nothing. 7 Marines broke from the wadi and began running for the channel. Kessler watched them move and felt something loosen in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. A chance, a possibility, a reason to keep fighting. Then the machine gun she had not seen opened fire. The position was on the southern ridge, hidden in shadows that her scope had not penetrated. The gunner had waited with professional patience, allowing her to focus on the eastern and western threats while he prepared his ambush. Now he raked the drainage channel with sustained fire, rounds chewing into the rocks where the fleeing Marines had taken cover. Kessler swung her rifle toward the new threat and felt her heart sink. 1,400 meters. The farthest shot she had ever attempted was 1,200. This was beyond her reliable range, beyond the capabilities of her weapon, beyond anything training had prepared her to accomplish. She did not have a choice. The gunner was partially visible, his body hunched behind the weapon as he poured fire into the channel. She calculated the adjustments for distance, for wind, for the slight curve of the bullet's trajectory over that immense span. She accounted for variables she could not measure and prayed to whatever forces governed the universe that she was close enough. She fired. The round struck rock 2 feet to the gunner's left. He flinched but kept firing. 8 rounds remaining. She adjusted and fired again. This time the round passed over his position, close enough to make him duck, but not close enough to matter. 7 rounds remaining. The Marines in the channel were pinned. She could see Fuentes trying to move forward, try to reach the others, but the volume of fire made any movement suicidal. The escape route she had fought so hard to open was closing again, sealed by a single gun she could not hit. Beside her, Okonkwo had pulled himself to her scope. His face was gray, and his hands shook with the effort of staying conscious. But his voice was steady as he read the wind. "Hold left 2 minutes," he said. "You're fighting the crosswind." She adjusted. The crosshairs settled on the gunner's chest. She exhaled and squeezed. 1,400 meters away, the gunner jerked backward and machine gun fell silent. 6 rounds remaining. The channel was open again. Marines were moving, scrambling over rocks and through the narrow passage she had cleared with blood and bullets. She counted them as they ran. Fuentes, 3 others, then more from the wadi, a stream of desperate men fleeing the trap that had nearly killed them all. But not everyone was moving. She scanned the wadi and found 5 Marines still pinned in a cluster near the northern edge. They were too far from the channel, cut off by fighters who had completed the encirclement in that sector. Among them she recognized Hollister, his face a mask of terror as he realized escape was no longer possible. Kessler looked at her rifle. 6 rounds, 5 Marines, dozens of enemy fighters between them and safety. The mathematics had finally defeated her. She could save some. She could not save all. And the ones she could not save included the man whose arrogance had caused all of this. "What do we do?" Okonkwo whispered. She did not answer. She was watching Fuentes, who had stopped at the channel exit and was looking back at the men still trapped. She saw the moment he made his decision, saw him turn and begin running back toward the wadi. "That kid is going to get himself killed," Okonkwo said. "Not if I can help it." She raised her rifle and began hunting for targets that would keep Fuentes alive long enough to do something impossibly brave or impossibly stupid. At this point, she could not tell the difference anymore. Fuentes ran like a man who had already accepted his death and decided it would not be today. He moved through the rocks with the fluid grace of youth, dodging between cover as rounds cracked past his head. Behind him, 3 Marines who had already escaped the channel were following, pulled back into danger by the gravity of his conviction. Kessler tracked the fighters, trying to cut him down. A man rising from behind a boulder to take aim. She fired, and he dropped. A second, adjusting his position for a better angle. She fired, and he fell. 4 rounds remaining. Fuentes reached the edge of the wadi where the 5 trapped Marines huddled. Hollister was shouting something at him, probably in order to fall back, probably the desperate words of a man who could not accept rescue from someone he outranked. Fuentes ignored him completely. He grabbed the nearest Marine and shoved him toward the channel, then did the same with the second. The 3 volunteers who had followed Fuentes spread out to provide covering fire. Their weapons barked in controlled bursts as enemy fighters tried to close the gap. It was a rearguard action, the kind of desperate measure that belonged in history books about last stands and heroic sacrifices. Kessler found another target, a fighter with an RPG launcher preparing to fire into the cluster of Americans. She could not let that rocket fly. She squeezed the trigger and watched him crumple, the launcher tumbling from his hands. 3 rounds remaining. 2 more Marines from the trapped group were running now, stumbling toward the channel with Fuentes pushing them forward. That left Hollister, still frozen behind his rock, still unable to move. Fuentes grabbed him by the tactical vest and physically dragged him to his feet. For a moment, Kessler saw their faces clearly through her scope. Fuentes, young and fierce, with the determination of someone who refused to leave anyone behind. Hollister, pale and trembling, with the hollow eyes of a man watching his illusions die. The captain who had dismissed her warnings being saved by the lance corporal who had listened. "Move," she whispered. "Move now." They moved. Fuentes half carried Hollister toward the channel while the 3 volunteers maintained their covering fire. Enemy fighters were closing from multiple directions now, sensing the Americans' desperation, smelling blood. The encirclement was complete everywhere except that narrow corridor she had opened with 19 bullets, and more luck than any sniper deserved. A fighter broke from cover and charged toward the retreating group. Kessler fired and missed, the round sparking off rock as the man kept coming. She worked the bolt and fired again, catching him in the hip. He went down screaming, but another took his place, then another. 1 round remaining. She could not protect them all. There were too many targets, and she had spent everything she had. The covering fire from the volunteers was slackening as they burned through their own ammunition. Fuentes was still dragging Hollister, still refusing to abandon the man who had nearly killed them all. Okonkwo's hand closed around her wrist. She turned to find him watching her with eyes that held more clarity than they should have given his wounds. "Go," he said. "What?" "You have to get down there. They need you in the channel. I will cover from here." She looked at his pistol, nearly empty, at his wounds, still bleeding despite the tourniquets, at his gray face and shallow breathing and the tremor in his hands that spoke of a body running on borrowed time. "You cannot even sit up straight," she said. "I can sit up straight enough to pull a trigger." His grip tightened on her wrist. "Yolanda, my daughter. She's going to grow up knowing her father died, protecting his people. That is a good death. That is the best death a man like me can hope for." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she forced them back. There was no time for grief. There was never time for grief. "I will tell her," Kessler said. "I will tell her everything. Tell her I loved her. Tell her I was thinking of her at the end. And tell her that the woman who saved her father's friends was the best Marine I ever served with." He released her wrist and turned his pistol toward the ridgeline where more fighters were approaching. 3 rounds in the magazine. Maybe 4. Enough to buy her 30 seconds if he made them count. Kessler did not say goodbye. Goodbyes were for people who had time, and time was the one thing neither of them possessed. She grabbed her rifle and began scrambling down the slope toward the channel, leaving behind a man who had spotted for her through 2 deployments, 3 firefights, and 1 impossible afternoon on a ridge that should never have been their battleground. Behind her, she heard the crack of his pistol, measured and deliberate. 1 shot, 2, a pause, then a third. She did not look back. The channel was chaos when she reached it. Marines were streaming through the narrow passage, some helping wounded, others providing rear security. Fuentes had gotten Hollister to the entrance and was pushing him forward when he saw Kessler appear. "Staff Sergeant," he shouted. "Where's Okonkwo?" She shook her head once and saw understanding flash across his face. Then grief, quickly buried. Then the hard resolve of a young man who was learning what war actually cost. "We need to move," she said. "Everyone through the channel. Now." The last of the trapped Marines stumbled into the corridor. The 3 volunteers who had provided covering fire fell back in good order, their weapons still ready. Behind them, enemy fighters were flooding into the wadi, but the narrowness of the channel worked in the Americans' favor now. Only 2 or 3 could pursue at a time, and the rear guard cut them down as they tried. Kessler took position at the back of the column, her rifle raised despite having only 1 round left. She walked backward through the channel, watching the shadows for threats, listening for the sounds of pursuit. Above and behind her, on the ridge that had been her home for the worst hour of her life, Okonkwo's pistol fired 1 final time. Then silence. She kept moving. She owed him that much. She owed him everything, but forward motion was all she had left to give. The channel opened into a shallow valley beyond the enemy's encirclement. Marines were spreading out, taking defensive positions, tending to wounded. Someone was on a radio calling for extraction. Someone else was performing first aid on a man with shrapnel wounds. And standing at the edge of the group, his face slack with shock, Captain Brent Hollister watched the woman who had saved his life walk out of a killing ground he had led them into. Kessler met his eyes for 1 long moment. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence between them held more weight than any words could carry. Then she turned away and went to help with the wounded. The valley beyond the channel offered no real safety, only distance. Kessler knew the enemy would regroup and pursue. They had invested too much in this ambush to let their prey escape without a final attempt to salvage their victory. The Americans had perhaps 15 minutes before fighters found alternate routes around the ridgelines and closed in again. 15 minutes to organize 17 shattered Marines into a defensible position. 15 minutes to establish communications with command. 15 minutes to survive until extraction arrived. She found Sergeant First Class DeMarco coordinating the perimeter, a stocky veteran with 20 years of service and the calm demeanor of a man who had seen worse and lived to collect his pension. He looked up as she approached, and she saw recognition flash in his eyes. Staff Sergeant Kessler, heard you were the one keeping those guns quiet. He gestured toward the ridge behind them. Where's your spotter? She did not answer. She did not need to. DeMarco's face tightened, and he nodded once. The universal acknowledgement of loss that combat veterans learned to give without words. What is our status? She asked. 17 personnel accounted for. 6 wounded, 2 critical. Captain Hollister is. DeMarco paused, choosing his words carefully. The captain is not currently issuing orders. Kessler looked across the valley to where Hollister sat against a rock, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes fixed on nothing. He had not spoken since emerging from the channel. The man who had led them into this disaster had retreated somewhere inside himself, leaving behind a hollow shell in a captain's uniform. Radio contact, she asked. DeMarco shook his head. Our primary is destroyed. Working on a backup, but the encryption module took shrapnel. Best case we get voice in 10 minutes. Air support. Dispatched, but 20 minutes out. Maybe more, depending on fuel state and threat assessment. 20 minutes. The enemy would reach them in 15. 5 minutes of fighting without support against a force that outnumbered them 3-1. Kessler surveyed the terrain. The valley sloped upward to the west, offering elevation but no cover. To the east, a dry stream bed provided concealment but limited fields of fire. North and south were open ground that would become killing fields if the enemy brought their machine guns. The stream bed, she said. We consolidate there, use the banks for cover. Put our best shooters on the high ground to the west with orders to fall back when pressed. DeMarco studied her for a moment. That is a sound defensive plan, Staff Sergeant. He glanced toward Hollister. You want to run it by the captain. The captain is combat ineffective. She said it flatly, without accusation or judgment. Just a statement of tactical reality. We do not have time for a command consultation. No, DeMarco agreed. We do not. He turned and began issuing orders. Marines moving with the desperate efficiency of men who understood their survival depended on the next 15 minutes. Kessler moved through the perimeter, checking positions, adjusting fields of fire, redistributing ammunition from the dead and wounded to those still able to fight. She had 7 rounds now, scavenged from a fallen Marine's magazine. 7 rounds and a pistol with 1 magazine remaining. She found Fuentes helping to carry one of the critically wounded toward the stream bed. The young Marine's face was streaked with dirt and blood, none of it his own, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone processing trauma in real time. Lance Corporal, she said. He looked up, and she saw him fight to focus. You did go back there, getting those men out. That was leadership. I just did what you showed me, he said. You opened the door. I walked through it. You went back. You could have kept running, but you went back. He was quiet for a moment, adjusting his grip on the stretcher. There was a sergeant once, he said, back in boot camp, told me the measure of a Marine is not what he does when people are watching. It is what he does when he thinks no one will ever know. He looked at her with something approaching wonder. You were up on that ridge alone. No one could see what you were doing, and you saved all of us anyway. Kessler did not know how to respond. She had not thought about witnesses or recognition. She had thought only about the mathematics of survival and the faces of the men she was trying to protect. Get to the stream bed, she said, and stay down when the shooting starts. Fuentes nodded and continued moving with his burden. Kessler watched him go and felt something shift in her chest. The Corps would be fine, she realized. As long as there were young men like Fuentes coming up through the ranks, the Corps would survive the Hollisters of the world. The perimeter took shape with the organized chaos that characterized Marines under pressure. Wounded were consolidated in the deepest part of the stream bed, protected by the banks on 3 sides. Shooters took positions along the rim, spacing themselves to create overlapping fields of fire. The 3 Marines with the most ammunition anchored the line at points most likely to receive the initial assault. Kessler climbed to the western high ground with 2 other marksmen. From this elevation, she could see the approaches from all directions, could identify threats before they closed to effective range. She settled into a prone position and began scanning the terrain. The first enemy scouts appeared 7 minutes later. They moved in pairs, working along the ridgelines, searching for the Americans they knew had escaped their trap. Kessler tracked them through her scope, but held her fire. 7 rounds. She could not waste any on scouts when the main assault would follow within minutes. Contact north, one of the Marines beside her reported. 15 plus moving in tactical formation. She shifted her scope and confirmed. A squad-sized element advancing through the rocks, using cover effectively, weapons ready. Professional soldiers executing a pursuit operation. Contact south, the other Marine reported. Another 10 or 12. 25 fighters minimum. Probably more following. Against 17 Marines, 6 of them wounded. Kessler checked her rifle one final time. Beside her, the 2 Marines did the same. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood what was coming. In the distance, she heard the faint thrum of helicopter rotors. Extraction was coming. The only question was whether any of them would still be alive when it arrived. She placed her crosshairs on the lead fighter of the northern group and waited for him to enter effective range. The last 15 minutes of her life were the first 15 minutes of everyone else's continued existence. Either way, she would make them count. The first fighter entered her effective range at 400 meters. Kessler exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. The man dropped and the battle began. Gunfire erupted along the perimeter as the enemy assault made contact. The northern group advanced in short rushes, 2 men moving while others provided covering fire, textbook infantry tactics executed with discipline. The southern group was less coordinated but more aggressive, fighters sprinting forward with the abandon of men who believed Allah would protect them or welcome them. Kessler worked her rifle with mechanical precision. A fighter rising to throw a grenade. Down. Another setting up a machine gun on a tripod. Down. A third directing his squad with hand signals. Down. 4 rounds remaining. The 2 Marines beside her were firing in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining enough volume to slow the advance. Below in the stream bed, DeMarco's voice carried over the din, steady and calm, directing fire and adjusting positions as the tactical situation evolved. The southern assault reached the edge of the stream bed first. Kessler heard the sharp crack of grenades, followed by screaming. Could not tell if the voices were American or enemy. She forced herself to maintain focus on the northern approach where the more disciplined fighters posed the greater threat. A burst of automatic fire stitched across her position, and one of the Marines beside her grunted and went still. She did not look. She could not look. The northern assault was 50 meters from the stream bed now, and if they reached the rim, the position would be overrun within seconds. She fired twice, dropping the 2 lead fighters, and reached for another magazine before remembering she did not have one. 2 rounds remained in her rifle. After that, she would be down to her pistol. The helicopters were louder now, close enough that she could distinguish the distinctive thump of Huey rotors. 5 minutes out, maybe less. An eternity measured in bullets and blood. Staff Sergeant, the surviving Marine beside her shouted. "I'm out. Fall back to the stream bed," she ordered. "Help with the wounded." He scrambled down the slope as she turned back to the northern approach. The assault had stalled momentarily, fighters seeking cover after watching their point men die. But she could see them regrouping, preparing for another push. When it came, she would have 2 bullets to stop 15 men. The southern assault was being held, barely. She could hear Fuentes shouting orders, his young voice carrying an authority that belonged to men twice his age. The kid was keeping that flank together through sheer force of will. Movement to her left drew her attention. A fighter had worked around the perimeter, approaching from an angle she had not covered. He was 20 meters away, rifle raised, sighting on her position. She swung her weapon toward him, knowing she would not be fast enough. The crack of a pistol sounded from below, and the fighter crumpled. Kessler looked down and saw Hollister standing at the edge of the stream bed, his sidearm extended, smoke curling from the barrel. His face was pale, but his hand was steady. Whatever paralysis had gripped him had broken in the moment when action became simpler than thought. Their eyes met. She nodded once. He nodded back. Then he turned and moved toward the southern perimeter where the fighting was heaviest. The northern assault resumed. Fighters poured over the rocks in a final desperate push, sensing that victory was close if they could just close the distance. Kessler fired her last 2 rounds and dropped her rifle, drawing her pistol as the first enemy reached the rim of the stream bed. She shot him in the chest at 3 meters, shot the man behind him in the face, kept shooting as more fighters spilled over the edge, her pistol barking in rapid succession until the slide locked back on an empty magazine. A fighter lunged at her with a knife, and she sidestepped, driving her elbow into his throat. Another grabbed her from behind, and she threw her head back, feeling cartilage crunch as her skull connected with his nose. She ripped his rifle from his hands and used it as a club, swinging wildly at the shapes pressing in from all sides. Then the helicopters arrived. The sound was deafening, rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris as 2 Hueys swept over the valley with door gunners blazing. Heavy machine gun fire tore through the enemy assault, scattering fighters like leaves in a hurricane. A third helicopter appeared, this one a Cobra gunship, its chin turret spitting fire into the northern ridgeline where enemy reinforcements had been massing. The assault broke. Fighters fled in every direction, abandoning their wounded, throwing down weapons in their haste to escape the aerial onslaught. The disciplined force that had executed a perfect ambush dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals running for their lives. Kessler stood at the rim of the stream bed, blood streaming from cuts on her face and hands, and watched them run. She felt nothing. Not relief, not triumph, not satisfaction. Just the hollow emptiness that came after the adrenaline faded and the cost of survival became clear. Behind her, Marines were shouting, some in celebration, others calling for medics. The wounded were being prepared for evacuation. Someone was crying, the raw sound of grief for friends who would not be going home. DeMarco appeared at her side. His uniform was torn and blood-soaked, but he was standing, which was more than could be said for too many others. 16 alive, he said. Rodriguez did not make it. The critical wounded are stable enough for transport. 16 out of 17. 1 dead in the valley. Okonkwo dead on the ridge. 2 lives lost because a map said low threat. The first Huey was landing now, its skids settling onto the rocky ground as crew chiefs jumped out to help with the wounded. Kessler watched Fuentes carrying a stretcher toward the aircraft, his face set with exhaustion, but his back straight with the pride of a man who had met his test and not been found wanting. Hollister stood apart from the others, watching the evacuation with the blank expression of someone who had not yet processed what had happened. His moment of clarity during the fight had faded, leaving behind the same hollow shell she had seen emerge from the channel. Staff Sergeant. DeMarco's voice pulled her attention. Your ride is here. She looked at the helicopter, at the Marines filing aboard, at the valley that had nearly become their grave. Then she looked at the ridge where Okonkwo's body still lay, alone and unrecovered. We are not leaving him, she said. DeMarco followed her gaze and understood. The Cobra is providing cover. We'll get a team up there before we extract. She nodded and finally allowed herself to move toward the waiting helicopter. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and unresponsive. Hands reached out to help her aboard, and she let them, sinking onto the metal deck as the rotors spun up for departure. Through the open door, she watched the ridge grow smaller, watched the valley where they had fought and bled and nearly died recede into the distance. Somewhere up there, Okonkwo was waiting to come home. She would make sure he did. She owed him that much. She owed him everything. Forward Operating Base Rawlinson looked different when Kessler stepped off the helicopter. The same tents, the same barriers, the same flags snapping in the desert wind. But she saw it now through eyes that had watched men die in a valley that should have been safe, and nothing would ever look quite the same again. Medical personnel swarmed the landing zone, triaging the wounded with practiced efficiency. Kessler waved off the corpsman who tried to examine her, pointing instead to the Marines on stretchers who needed attention far more than she did. Her wounds could wait. Everything could wait until she knew Okonkwo was coming home. DeMarco found her 20 minutes later outside the Tactical Operations Center. A recovery team was being assembled, he said. 2 squads with air cover, launching within the hour. They would retrieve Okonkwo's body and sweep the ridge for any intelligence value. She wanted to go with them. She wanted to be the one to carry him down from that ridge, to ensure he was treated with the dignity he deserved. But the battalion commander had already made clear that she was grounded until the debrief was complete and her wounds were properly treated. The debrief began at 1900 hours in a tent that smelled of coffee and tension. Colonel Marcus Webb presided, a lean man with silver at his temples and the quiet intensity of an officer who had earned his rank in combat rather than conference rooms. Beside him sat the battalion intelligence officer, the operations officer, and a woman in civilian clothes whose presence no one explained. Kessler sat across from them and told the story from the beginning. The briefing where she raised concerns. The dismissal by Captain Hollister. The patrol, the ambush, the ridge. Every shot she had taken, every decision she had made, every life she had saved, and the 2 she had not. She spoke for 47 minutes without interruption. When she finished, the tent was silent. Colonel Webb leaned forward. Staff Sergeant, you stated that you identified potential enemy positions in the satellite imagery before the mission. Can you describe what you observed? Kisla noted. The rock formations on the western ridge showed evidence of human modification. Straight lines where there should have been natural irregularity. Shadow patterns consistent with constructed fighting positions. The imagery was clear enough that any trained analyst should have flagged it for further review. The intelligence officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The pre-mission assessment was conducted according to standard protocols. The sector had shown minimal enemy activity for 6 weeks prior. Minimal visible activity, Kessler said. The absence of movement can indicate preparation as easily as absence of threat. That is basic pattern analysis. Colonel Webb held up a hand before the intelligence officer could respond. He turned to the woman in civilian clothes. Ms. Chun, your assessment. The woman opened a folder and studied its contents for a moment before speaking. Her voice was flat, clinical, devoid of the emotional weight that filled the tent. I have reviewed the original imagery and Staff Sergeant Kessler's observations. The indicators she identified are present and should have triggered additional analysis under current protocols. The failure to do so represents a significant deviation from established procedures. The intelligence officer's face went pale. Sir, I can explain. You will have that opportunity, Colonel Webb said, in a formal inquiry that will convene tomorrow morning. He turned back to Kessler. Staff Sergeant, I want to be clear about something. You raised these concerns before the mission and were overruled by your commanding officer. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And Captain Hollister characterized your concerns as what, exactly? Kisla hesitated. She could bury Hollister with a single sentence, could ensure his career ended in disgrace. Part of her wanted exactly that, but another part remembered him standing at the edge of the stream bed, pistol extended, saving her life in the moment when it mattered most. The captain indicated that he had confidence in the intelligence assessment. She said carefully. He felt my concerns were not supported by the available evidence. Colonel Webb studied her for a long moment. His eyes held the knowing look of a man who understood exactly what she was not saying and why. Captain Hollister is currently under medical observation, he said. Initial reports suggest acute combat stress reaction. He will be evaluated by mental health professionals before any command decisions are made regarding his future. Kisla noted. She felt no satisfaction in Hollister's breakdown. He had been arrogant and wrong, and his failures had cost lives. But he had also been a man in over his head, promoted beyond his capabilities by a system that valued connections over competence. The fault was not his alone. There is one more matter, Colonel Webb said. He glanced at the woman in civilian clothes, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Staff Sergeant, Your actions on that ridge are being reviewed for formal recognition. I cannot discuss specifics at this time, but I want you to understand that what you accomplished today has not gone unnoticed. Kessler thought of Okonkwo alone on that ridge, waiting for the recovery team to bring him home. She thought of his daughter taking her first steps while her father bled out in the dust of a country she would never see. With respect, sir, she said, Corporal Okonkwo should be recognized. He spotted for me until he physically could not continue. He provided covering fire that allowed me to reach the channel. He died so that I could help save the others. Colonel Webb nodded slowly. Corporal Okonkwo will receive appropriate recognition. You have my word. The debrief continued for another hour, covering tactical details and timeline reconstruction and the dozen small decisions that had meant the difference between survival and annihilation. When it finally ended, Kessler walked out into the night air and stood beneath stars that looked exactly as they had 24 hours ago, before everything changed. Fuentes found her there, his arm in a sling she had not noticed him wearing before. Recovery team just radioed in, he said. They have Corporal Okonkwo. Bring him home now. Kessler closed her eyes and felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly, not peace, but something adjacent to both, a loosening of the knot that had formed the moment she watched Okonkwo fall still on that ridge. Thank you, she said. Fuentes stood beside her in silence for a moment. Then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. Staff Sergeant, what you did up there, I have never seen anything like it. I do not think anyone has. She opened her eyes and looked at him. In the darkness, his face was young and old at the same time, marked by experiences that would shape him for the rest of his life. What I did, she said, was what any Marine would do. I saw a problem, and I solved it. That is all. No, he shook his head. That is not all. You saw what no one else would see. You spoke when no one else would speak. And when they would not listen, you saved them anyway. He paused. That is not what any Marine would do. That is what you did. She did not know how to respond. So she said nothing, and they stood together in the darkness, waiting for the helicopter that would bring Dwayne Okonkwo home. 3 weeks passed before Kessler was cleared to leave the forward operating base. Her wounds healed in the efficient way of a body accustomed to damage, leaving scars that would fade with time but never disappear entirely. The wound inside, the one that throbbed whenever she thought of Okonkwo, showed no signs of healing at all. The inquiry into the intelligence failure concluded with findings that would never be made public, but whose consequences rippled through the chain of command. 2 analysts were reassigned to positions where their negligence could not cost lives. Protocols were revised, additional review layers implemented, boxes checked that should have been checked before 17 Marines walked into a trap. Captain Hollister received a medical discharge. Combat stress, the paperwork said. Unfit for continued service. He would go home to his family connections and his father's business and a life that would never include another command. Kessler felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy. He was simply gone, a chapter closed, a lesson learned by everyone except the 2 men who had paid the ultimate price for his arrogance. She visited Okonkwo's body before it was transported home. He lay in a flag-draped casket in the base chapel, his face peaceful in a way it had never been in life. She stood beside him for a long time, saying nothing, remembering everything. The way he laughed at her terrible jokes. The way he always knew what she was thinking before she said it. The way he had insisted on climbing that ridge beside her even when he could barely walk. I will find her, she said finally. Your daughter. I will tell her what you asked me to tell her. And I will make sure she knows who her father really was. The casket offered no response. She had not expected one. But speaking the words aloud made them a promise, and promises were the only currency that mattered anymore. Fuentes was promoted to corporal 2 days before Kessler's departure. She pinned the chevrons on his collar herself, a small ceremony attended by the survivors of that day in the valley. 16 Marines standing in formation, honoring one of their own who had proven himself under fire. You earned this, she told him, not because of what happened out there, because of who you showed yourself to be. He stood straighter than she had ever seen him stand. Staff Sergeant, I have a request. Go ahead. When you get back to the States, when you visit Corporal Okonkwo's family. He paused, struggling with words that did not come easily. Tell them I was there. Tell them their husband and father saved my life too. I want them to know. I will tell them, she said. I will tell them everything. The flight home took 22 hours across multiple aircraft and 3 time zones. Kessler slept for none of it. She sat in transport seats and terminal chairs and watched the world scroll past beneath her, thinking about the conversation she would have to have with a woman she had never met and a child who would never remember her father's face. Okonkwo's wife was named Denise. She lived in a small house outside Camp Lejeune, the kind of modest military housing that families made into homes through sheer force of love. Kessler stood on the porch for 3 full minutes before she found the courage to knock. The woman who answered the door was beautiful in the way of people who had learned to carry grief with grace. Her eyes were red, but her back was straight, and when she saw Kessler's uniform, her face shifted through recognition and pain and something that might have been gratitude. "You are Yolanda," she said. "Dwayne told me about you." Kisla nodded. She found she cannot speak. Denise stepped back and opened the door wider. "Please, come in." The living room was small and warm, filled with photographs that charted a life Kessler had only known pieces of. Okonkwo in his dress blues on their wedding day. Okonkwo holding a newborn wrapped in pink blankets. Okonkwo laughing at a barbecue, surrounded by friends, alive in a way that photographs could never fully capture. A little girl sat on the carpet, surrounded by blocks, watching the stranger in uniform with curious eyes. She was perhaps 14 months old, with her father's broad face and her mother's gentle expression. "This is Maya," Denise said. "She does not understand yet. I do not know if she ever will." Kessler knelt on the carpet, bringing herself to the child's level. Maya studied her with the fearless appraisal of the very young, then offered her a red block with the solemnity of a sacred gift. "Thank you," Kessler said. Her voice cracked on the second word. Denise sat on the couch and watched them interact. After a moment, she spoke again. "The officer who came to notify me. He said Dwayne died in combat. He said he was a hero, but he could not tell me what happened. He said the details were classified." Kessler looked up from the blocks. "The details are not classified. They just did not know them." She told the story. All of it. The ambush, the ridge, the shots that opened the escape route. Okonkwo spotting for her with blood filling his lungs. Okonkwo refusing to stay behind when she climbed toward the guns. Okonkwo's final words, spoken on a ridge 14,000 miles away, about the daughter who would never hear his voice. Denise wept silently through most of it. When Kessler reached the end, she wiped her eyes and looked at her daughter with an expression that contained multitudes. "He said that," she asked. "He said he was thinking of her." His exact words. Kessler reached into her pocket and withdrew the compass she had carried for 15 years. She held it out to Denise. "This belonged to my father. He died because of negligent leadership, same as Dwayne almost died. I have carried it every day since his funeral, trying to make sure his death meant something." She pressed the compass into Denise's hands. "I want Maya to have it. I want her to know that her father's death meant something too." Denise looked at the compass, then at Kessler, then at the little girl building towers on the carpet. "He saved them," she said. "All those Marines. Because of him, they came home. Because of him," Kessler agreed. "And I promise you, as long as I live, I will make sure no one forgets that." Maya knocked over her tower and laughed at the destruction. The sound filled the small room, bright and innocent and utterly unaware of the weight being exchanged between the 2 women above her. Kessler stayed for 2 hours. She answered every question Denise asked, described every moment she could remember, painted a picture of the man Okonkwo had been when a uniform came off and the real person emerged. When she finally left, Denise hugged her on the porch and whispered something in her ear. "Thank you for bringing him home to us." Kessler walked to her car and sat behind the wheel for a long time, watching the house where a little girl would grow up knowing her father was a hero. The compass was gone from her pocket now, passed to a new generation, but the weight it had carried remained. Some burdens cannot be set down. Some promises lasted forever. She started the engine and drove toward the next chapter of her life, carrying Okonkwo with her in the only way that mattered anymore. In her memory, in her purpose, in a story she would tell for as long as she lived. 6 months later, Kessler stood in a sunlit auditorium at Marine Corps Base Quantico, wearing dress blues she had pressed 3 times to ensure every crease was perfect. The room was filled with uniforms and families, officers and enlisted, all gathered to witness something that happened rarely enough to draw attention from the highest levels of command. She had tried to refuse the ceremony, tried to argue that she had only done her job, that any Marine in her position would have made the same choices. Colonel Webb had listened patiently to her objections and then told her, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that she would stand in that auditorium and accept what the Corps had decided to give her. The citation was read by a brigadier general whose name she forgot the moment she heard it. The words washed over her in waves, clinical descriptions of actions that had felt like instinct at the time. Disregarding her own safety, eliminating multiple enemy positions, creating an avenue of escape for trapped personnel. The language of commendation reduced the chaos and terror of that day to neat sentences that would fit in an official file. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of her life above and beyond the call of duty, the general read. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Kessler distinguished herself by extraordinary heroism while engaged in combat operations against enemy forces. She heard Okonkwo's name mentioned, heard the acknowledgement of his sacrifice, the posthumous recognition that would mean everything to Denise and Maya and nothing to the man who had earned it. The Navy Cross they had awarded him would hang in that small house outside Camp Lejeune, a cold piece of metal standing in for the warm presence that should have been there to watch his daughter grow. The silver star felt heavy when it was pinned to her chest. She stood at attention while cameras flashed and applause filled the room, feeling like a fraud wearing a hero's decoration. Heroes were people who made choices. She had simply reacted, done what training and instinct demanded, survived when survival should have been impossible. Afterward, there was a reception with finger food and polite conversation. Officers she had never met congratulated her on her achievement. Families of the Marines she had saved approached with tears in their eyes and gratitude in their voices. She accepted their thanks with the grace her mother had taught her, saying the right words while feeling nothing at all. Fuentes found her near the back of the room, trying to escape the attention that pressed against her like a physical weight. He was a sergeant now, promoted again based on his actions in the valley and his continued excellence in the months since. The young man who had frozen at his first firefight had become the kind of leader other Marines looked to for guidance. "You're supposed to be enjoying this," he said. "Big hero, fancy medal, your name in the papers." "I never wanted my name in the papers." She looked at the silver star on her chest. "I wanted the mission to go right. I wanted everyone to come home. 15 out of 17 did. Because of you. 2 did not. Because of failures that should never have happened." Fuentes was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "This came to the unit last week. It was addressed to you, but you had already transferred to Quantico for the ceremony. I thought you should have it." She opened the envelope and found a photograph inside. Maya Okonkwo, now nearly 2 years old, standing in a garden with a huge smile on her face. She was holding something in her tiny hands, and when Kessler looked closer, she saw it was the compass. Her father's compass, passed to a new keeper who would carry it into a future none of them could imagine. On the back of the photograph, in Denise's careful handwriting, were 4 words. "She asks about you." Kessler stared at those words until they blurred. She blinked hard and slipped the photograph into her pocket, next to her heart, where it would stay. "Staff Sergeant Kessler." She turned to find Colonel Webb approaching, accompanied by a woman she recognized from the debrief. Ms. Chun, the analyst who had confirmed the intelligence failure. They made an unlikely pair, the weathered combat officer and the precise civilian, but something in their expression suggested they had come with a shared purpose. "There is a matter we would like to discuss with you," Webb said. "Privately, if you have a moment." They walked to a small office away from the reception. Chen closed the door, while Webb gestured for Kessler to sit. She remained standing instead, too wired from the ceremony to settle into a chair. The intelligence failures that contributed to your mission have prompted a review of our analytical protocols, Chen said. New positions are being created. Positions for people who understand both the operational realities of combat and the analytical requirements of threat assessment. Webb leaned forward. What she's trying to say is that we need people who can look at a map marked low threat and see the danger everyone else missed. People who will speak up even when their superiors do not want to hear it. He paused. People like you. Kessler looked between them, processing the implication. You want me to become an analyst? We want you to become a bridge, Chun said. Someone who can translate between the people in the field and the people behind the desks. Someone who can make sure what happened in that valley never happens again. She thought of Okonkwo, bleeding on the ridge, asking her to tell his daughter he loved her. She thought of her father, dead in a training accident that paperwork had buried. She thought of 16 Marines who went home to their families because she had seen what no one else would see. The pattern repeated. It always repeated, unless someone broke the cycle. When do I start? She asked. Webb smiled for the first time since she had met him. Monday, 0800. Welcome to the team, Staff Sergeant. The reception continued without her. She walked outside into the Virginia sunshine and stood on the steps of the auditorium, feeling the weight of the medal on her chest and the photograph in her pocket, and the future opening before her like a door she had not known existed. If you connected with this story, drop a comment and share your thoughts. Tell us about your favorite moment, or about someone in your life who spoke up when no one wanted to listen. Those people are the ones who change the world, one voice at a time. Kessler looked up at the sky, clear and blue and infinite. Somewhere out there, she liked to think Okonkwo was watching, smiling at the compass in his daughter's hands. Proud of the woman who had carried him home. She touched the silver star once, then let her hand fall. There was work to do, lives to save, patterns to break, and she would not stop until every map told the truth.